Before you even say it, I realize that I look like the theater thug. I don't know how else to say it. We've done it, folks. Our first next-gen review of a game is here, stylishly late after all the hype has died down and no one will see this. Here I am, topical and timely. Spider-Man Miles Morales. Yes, I played on PS5, and considering there are only like 30 consoles available worldwide, I feel lucky to have even snagged one. I've had this big thing for a few weeks, so I've been able to play Miles Morales and play a bit of Spider-Man Remastered. We'll discuss Spider-Man Remastered in another video. Now, clearly you're not here to listen to me talk about anything, or anything in particular, besides the game, so let's do it. Spider-Man Miles Morales. Now, Miles Morales was a surprise announcement months ago during the summer. I think most of us assumed another Spider-Man game was at least another year or two away, maybe more. So, it was a welcome surprise. And now, here we are. Now, let's get something out of the way right now. Miles Morales doesn't really reinvent the wheel or represent a drastic departure is how you say that word, from Spider-Man 2018. And that's not a bad thing. A lot of what made Spider-Man 2018 so good is still here in Miles Morales with a little small refinement and some brand new story. And it really helps sell it that it's stunning too. Subtle facial animations and the wind slowly swaying hair back and forth, light realistically cast shadows over characters' faces and buildings. All of that combines to make this one of the best looking games out there. Of course, you have two modes to play in. There's 60 FPS mode or performance mode, where you play at what they have said is a dynamic 4K. How I understand it is that it's not exactly 4K. It's kind of like a lower resolution sample that they upscale, and that way it allows you to play in 60 FPS at a kind of a fake 4K, but if you don't notice the difference, who cares, really? And then there's a 30 FPS or fidelity mode, and you play at a true 4K with ray tracing and other enhanced visual aspects enabled. As far as which one's better for you, that's up to you. I played the game once in performance mode, and you will notice missing visual details like reflections and buildings if you look for them. Maybe you're afraid of your own reflection, like I am. If so, the perfect mode awaits you. But the 60 FPS holds up pretty well, and to the extent that there are drop frames, I didn't notice. Now, I started a New Game Plus in Fidelity mode. If you just flip the two modes back and forth, you may not notice a big difference, but I do encourage you to try both for an extended period of time, and you'll definitely notice that difference more starkly. Whether or not that loss of visual detail bothers you is, again, up to you. And the game looks great no matter what, so you don't have to feel like you're losing something if you opt for 60 FPS or ruining the experience. But I will say that nothing beats swinging around the city in 60 FPS, it just feels so darn satisfying. Did I just say darn? Combat-wise, Miles moves pretty similarly to Peter. He has some different abilities that make him a bit different, and even then you could even argue a bit overpowered in some instances. There's not as many gadgets to mess around with, but it's probably by design because Miles doesn't strike you as someone who is so gadget-heavy, and he is relatively new to the whole Spider-Man thing, so again, not good or bad, just something to note. In later parts of the game, when you're pretty leveled up, you can begin to feel a bit overpowered as Miles, and he has a few abilities that give him a pretty significant edge, despite the game trying to create obstacles to neutralize the strength of those abilities, such as enemies that are able to suppress them. The music in Miles Morales seeks to differentiate itself from its predecessor. Instead of largest orchestral-type tracks from Spider-Man, Miles Morales goes for catchy, beat-driven hip-hop tracks that I personally really enjoyed. It does really help separate Peter from Miles. Now, that's not to say that those bigger orchestral type scores don't exist, but Miles plays with the idea that you might be playing as Spider-Man, but he is still a different Spider-Man. That being said, there is something kind of heartwarming and relatable about Miles as he begins to navigate this double life of being Spider-Man and his life at home. Najee Jeter really brings Miles to life. He sells the duality of someone who has great responsibility but doesn't think he is the right one to wield it, but nonetheless persists. Now, writing-wise, the story is fairly good. It doesn't necessarily have the complexity or density of the original game. But considering they are packing all of this development of character and story into a smaller, self-contained narrative, it's pretty successful in what it sets out to do. Tell an engaging story that tugs at the heart, and doesn't really leave much room for filler, or any wasted time. The main antagonist is also just as finely done as in the original. There's a bit less development just based on the brisk pace of the narrative, and I don't want to say much more for fear of spoiling it for you. Suffice to say, despite how brief the narrative can be, especially if you opt to go for New Game Plus and try to breeze through the story, there is a clear villain, but also conversely an antagonist that is not as clear. I'm being intentionally vague as to not spoil anything. Speaking of filler, one of the biggest criticisms of the original Spider-Man game, one that I also had, was that it didn't do much to change up the formula of its open world design. Here are some tasks. Hit a vantage point to reveal the map. Oh, collectibles? Here you go! More tasks! Miles Morales is similar in that you'll get similar tasks and collectibles, but it feels a bit less forced than it did in 2018. It's more natural, and while it's not a 100% reinvention, there's a certain way it delivers its content that reduces that sense of fatigue and exhaustion I think you can sometimes get in other open world games that are filled with meaningless filler content. Do the things! Do the things! Why? 'Cause you can. It gives you more tasks slowly throughout the game. It feels organic, where in 2018 it felt like there was just the same content throughout each district. It doesn't do that here. Not every portion of the map has the same objectives and content, and it's not bloated. It really does feel like they're just telling you a small story with similar high stakes, but without overwhelming you with content at the outset. Now, traversal remains the game's best and most satisfying mechanic. It's a legitimate thrill to swing around the city and try to go faster and faster and do tricks in the air. I never fast traveled in either of these games because I felt that swinging around was just so utterly satisfying that it just didn't feel right. It felt dirty and wrong to fast travel. That being said, if you do fast travel, there's no loading screens in this game at all. I didn't notice one. Even just starting up the game, it just kind of starts and you're in. So Miles Morales is a great follow-up to a great game. It doesn't reinvent things or even provide the most drastic of next-gen experiences we will likely see, but as a launch title, hell, as a game by itself, it's more than worth it. Miles Morales succeeds in giving the title character his time to shine in the spotlight, while also continuing to build out the greater universe and even leaves the door open for more. Now, I will say, if this is what we can expect from the next Spider-Man, maybe even a two-protagonist Spider-Person game with Peter and Miles, which is my personal hope of what I want to see, it's going to be incredible. Anyway, without further ado, I hope you're able to get a console if you want one, but if not, Miles Morales is available on PS4, and either version I'm sure is worth the price of admission, so I can recommend it without hesitation. Also, one last thing I'll say is that suits you get are really cool and have their personality and their own personality, but I just can't not play as the default suit because I really just like the design so much. Now, my worry is this game is going to be lost amongst the conversation as we are seeing more games come out out for the PS5 and the Xbox Series X, but this is purely anecdotal, but I have a few friends who have it and who have said that they're going to play it at some point, but just haven't yet. And hearing that a few times made me think that this game could possibly move under the radar a bit. I mean, it does have a couple nominations in the Game Awards, but that's about it. I don't really see much conversation around it. The only reason I bring that up is just to say that this game is good, and don't sleep on it. Don't be intimidated by the shorter length. It's still well worth it. As usual, I'm Ryan. I play games sometimes. I talk about them. Subscribe here if you want to see more, or if you feel pity for me. Thanks. I'll see you later. I love you. Maybe. Before I go, I wanted to mention two more things. This was added on after I recorded everything and edited it together, hence why it is technically out of place, but I almost forgot to mention these last two things. So just bear with me, please. I just wanted to say that there's just something to be said about the side content. It's contextualized a lot more, so you're not just doing things for the sake of it. There feels like there's a purpose to it. Some of the activities have you completing tasks for people in Harlem, and like other media before it, it manages to make Harlem a character in and of itself at times. You may not spend much time there, but you feel more tuned into what is happening in Harlem specifically. There's a camaraderie that comes across, and you as the player form an attachment to the characters, major and supporting alike. Again, it's not reinventing the landscape of open world design, but like its 2018 predecessor before it, it just does it so well that it's hard to ignore it, or not give it props.
But how am I gonna know which one it is?
If you can check their license plates, we'll know which one shouldn't be out there.
You can count on me then. Genki, there are 3 feast trucks out in the city and one of them is phony. Could use your help here.
You could use the camera in your suit to grab license plate numbers.
And it just boasts a well-rounded story overall and cast. Save for a few, almost every character you encounter, you can understand their pain, their reasons for their actions, even if they're not doing the right thing. It just goes to show how savvy Insomniac is at telling a story, that they're able to give so much depth and nuance to almost every character in such a short time span without sacrificing the quality. It's why, for me, the story works so well. Okay, now I'm actually going to go. Like, dislike, comment, subscribe, help me or don't. Either way, we're cool. Thanks. Love you. Maybe.